Shalom, Jackie, and welcome to episode 25 of my English Sovereigns podcast series. Today I will be examining the reign of King Stephen. For those of you wondering what that reference was at the beginning of the Shalom, it wasn't just randomly inserted. It's Jim from Friday Night Dinner. Thought I'd spice up the introduction a little bit. Anyhow, on to the substance. A little bit of background about Stephen. He was the son of Adela, who was the daughter of William the Conqueror, and Adela had married Stephen, the Count of Blois. Blois being a territory in France, which is southwest of Paris, south of Normandy, and west of Anjou. Stephen had an older brother called William, who was considered to be intellectually disabled. So Adela passed William over for inheritance to Stephen, which was fortunate for Stephen, but not so much for William. Stephen came into Henry I's orbit because the territory of Blois was a bulwark, or a very good place strategically for Henry to launch raids against Louis VI of France, or indeed to defend against him. So that's quite useful, and eventually he got Stephen to marry Matilda of Boulogne. This is different from Henry's own daughter, Matilda. There are quite a lot of Matildas hanging around at the time. It does get a little bit less tense in the next reign, but yeah, quite a few Matildas. And this granted him a lot of land in England, and actually allowed him quite a large and very power base, which would help him take the throne of England. The only other thing he did before his reign, which I think was of note, was that he was one of the noblemen who took the oath to the Empress Matilda being Henry I's only other legitimate heir, and she was Empress because she married the Holy Roman Emperor earlier on in her life. He had taken the oath to her in 1127 that he would, be fine with her becoming the queen after Henry's death. This didn't happen, as you might be unsurprised to hear. He disregarded the 1127 oath in 1135 when Henry died, sailing over from Boulogne to England, and he was crowned in December 1135, got papal recognition 2 months later, which you might think is kind of a trump card once the Pope decides to get involved, but Empress Matilda was not having it. And Stephen knew this, so the first few years of Stephen's reign was spent bolstering the defences of the castles, building some new Motte and Bailey castles, making sure his power bases were shored up, the noblemen and the barons were satisfied and well armed, and obviously Matilda and her husband Geoffrey of Anjou were also, preparing an invasion force, which eventually landed in 1139 at Wareham in Dorset. This began a period called the Anarchy. Historians have disagreed as to whether this term is accurate. It is accurate in the sense that some counties in England were sort of centre points of continual sieges and battles, and such as Berkshire and Oxfordshire were quite heavily attacked, so devastation and anarchy ruled there because no one knew who was in charge. But in other places, such as perhaps in East Anglia or Essex, perhaps there wasn't so much of a anarchy, so it applies in some places but not in others. Initially, Stephen saw Robert of Gloucester, who was Henry I's illegitimate son, as the bigger threat. So when Stephen managed to corner Empress Matilda at a castle called Arundel in West Sussex, Stephen decided to let the Empress Matilda just leave unencumbered without being captured or anything like that. And allegedly Stephen did this out of a sense of chivalry. Thought, well, women can't run sieges or anything like that, are going to be nice. And that was his temperament. He was deemed to be quite a well-mannered and genial person. Although he was also seen as a man of firm action. So while this was quite a nice action, it certainly wasn't very Machiavellian. And as the last legitimate heir of Henry I, I don't know if it might have been a little bit more sensible to have actually captured her there. But he didn't. So the war raged on, and things came to a head at Lincoln in February 1141, which Stephen lost decisively. The path being cleared and Stephen being captured, Empress Matilda marched into London, but the Archbishop of Canterbury refused to crown her as queen, and the citizens of London, who, as custom, had proclaimed the next monarch, decided to reject her as well. So that didn't go so well for Empress Matilda. This inspired the other Matilda, namely Stephen's wife, to take matters into her own hands, so she came to London afterwards, gathered an army, and captured Robert at Winchester. It's called the Rout of Winchester, where basically they were just caught completely unawares. And eventually they went into negotiation, and Stephen and Robert were swapped, so both Matildas got their significant other back, which was quite useful. But it was basically the status quo ante bellum, which means, before the war that was how things were. So, and basically a stalemate from then on raged until 1146, and this was, again, another thing of devastation. The economy couldn't really get moving, obviously, because there's just war, no one knows who's really in charge. And then finally, by 1147, the Second Crusade had begun. Some nobles had decided to leave because they thought they'd had enough and wanted glory elsewhere. Robert of Gloucester himself died. Empress Matilda up sticks and decided to move back to Normandy, which Geoffrey of Anjou had conquered on her behalf. And then therefore the tempo of war simply decreased. It was only until 1153 that the war kind of picked up again. Henry, who was the son of Empress Matilda and Geoffrey of Anjou, invaded Wallingford in Oxfordshire, and Stephen, because his son Eustace had died just before, and the Pope and the clergy would not recognise Eustace's claim to the throne despite Stephen's intense lobbying, Stephen saw the writing on the wall and thought he needs to name an heir. So in a negotiation at the Treaty of Winchester, Stephen decided to name Henry as his heir to the throne. Whether or not this was just a temporary measure, we can't quite know, because Stephen died the next year in 1154. But Stephen did have another son called William, and it might have been that Stephen needed to shore up his power base, which he was actually doing after he signed the Treaty of Winchester, going up on royal progresses up north. But we can't know whether or not the treaty was meant to last. So Henry became king as Henry II after Stephen's death. So in terms of assessment of Stephen, the picture that you see is of Stephen. It shows Stephen has quite weird eyes. I mean, this was a portrait of him done in the 1620s, I think, but it makes him a little bit confused. This isn't really what he was like. It wasn't really an accurate representation, or it's just a really bad painting, I don't know. But yeah, he was genial, and his chivalry, I suppose, in a sense, was admirable, because obviously at the time, people were very chivalrous. It was the medieval period. But I don't think he was especially strategic in his actions. As I said, letting Empress Matilda leave at Arundel was a bit of a stupid move, I think. However chivalrous it might have been. And he didn't really take too many risks, in that he could have adopted the French tradition of crowning your son king even though you're still alive, which Henry II, I think, actually did. So he didn't do that, and I think he didn't take enough risk. But he did show a degree of political realism in naming Henry heir, I think. So if you're going to rank Stephen, I don't think he's all that bad a king. His reign is marked by quite a lot of tumultuousness and turmoil. And there isn't too much else to know about him other than this period of anarchy. But he managed to make sure Empress Matilda didn't become queen, and therefore obviously delaying having a female monarch until 1553 with either Lady Jane Grey, who I've not counted, or Queen Mary I. So that is that. I will see you for episode 26 with King Henry II.